The town sat quiet under the weight of a dry wind. Dust rolled through its empty street like a restless spirit, kicking up small clouds against the wooden boards of the saloon and the church that leaned tiredly on the hill. Folks kept their heads down that morning, not out of respect but out of fear. They had heard he was coming back. James Holloway, outlaw, rider of raids, man with more blood on his hands than any river could wash clean. His name had become a whisper spoken behind shut doors. He was a figure parents warned their children about when the fire burned low. The first sign of him was the black horse, tall and restless, cutting across the horizon like a storm cloud that refused to break. Its hooves struck the earth in a steady rhythm, and on its back sat a man dressed in dust-dark clothes, his face set in a silence that needed no words. The pistol on his hip was worn smooth from use, and the scars beneath his coat told of battles few had lived to see. James rode slowly down the main street, and every eye turned without daring to meet his. He did not tip his hat or greet a soul. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a roll of gold coins and tossed them to the ground near the saloon porch. The coins rang sharply against the boards. "Silence," he said, his voice low, more command than request. "You didn't see me. You don't know me. Keep your tongue still." Men bent quick to gather the gold, none bold enough to question the price. A hush swept the street deeper than before, but not everyone moved. From the edge of the street, near the small inn with its cracked windows and hanging sign, stood Clara. She was not much to look at least in the way the town measured worth. Plain dress, hands worn from work, and eyes the soft color of river stones. But there was a steadiness about her, a kind of quiet that did not bend before fear. She watched James as he passed, her gaze unbroken. While others lowered their heads, she lifted hers, though her hands trembled just enough for her to clasp them tight behind her apron. James noticed. He always noticed. He drew his horse to a stop in front of the inn and studied her the way a wolf studies a lantern in the dark, curious, cautious, half ready to strike. He could see she knew him, or at least the stories. That alone was dangerous. He swung down from the saddle, boots thudding against the earth. The air felt thick, as though the whole town held its breath. He walked toward her, every step heavy with the weight of his reputation. When he stood before her, he reached again for gold. He pressed the coins into her hand, the metal cold against her skin. "Forget," he said. Just one word. That was how he had lived. Buying silence, buying shadows to bury the truth of his life. Clara did not close her hand around the gold. She looked at it, then at him. Her eyes did not waver. Something in that gaze unsettled James more than the sheriff's badge or the sound of a rifle being cocked. The silence between them stretched. Behind him, the town kept still. Ahead of him, the woman did not bow to fear. James felt a strange unease, the first crack in the armor he had worn for years. He had come to bury his name in gold and silence. Instead, he found eyes that saw more than he wanted to show. And though the sun still burned hot above, a chill traced down his spine. Clara held the coins for a moment longer, her fingers trembling as though she carried something far heavier than gold. The street stayed hushed, all ears straining to hear what she might do. She looked at the coins again, then slowly opened her hand. They spilled onto the dirt with a dull sound, half buried in the dust at her feet. James frowned. Few had ever dared refuse him. Fewer still had dared to toss away what he offered. "You don't want it?" His voice carried the low edge of warning. Clara shook her head. "Gold doesn't buy silence. It only buys fear. A man doesn't need fear. He needs peace." Her words fell softly, but they cut deep. James was used to gunfire and threats, to men shouting with rage or begging for mercy. But this was different. A woman standing in plain daylight, her voice gentle as rain, yet heavy with truth. He felt the town's eyes pressing on him, waiting for his response. For years, James had solved problems one way. Quick, cold, final. His hand twitched near the gun at his side, more out of habit than intent. But Clara did not flinch. She stood steady, her gaze fixed on him like she saw through all the masks he carried. After a long pause, James bent and picked up the coins. He slipped them back into his coat. "You don't know me," he muttered, his tone sharp. "I know enough," she answered quietly. The words unsettled him more than any accusation. He turned without reply and strode into the inn. Clara let him pass, though her chest rose and fell with quiet force, her hands still shaking. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded by drawn curtains. The inn smelled of wood smoke, bread gone stale, and lavender soap. James set his bag down on the counter. "How long do you plan to stay?" Clara asked from behind him. Her voice carried no judgment, only a steady calm. James did not turn. "Long enough?" She nodded once. "Then you'll need a room." He expected her to hesitate, to ask him to leave, but she did not. She handed him a key with fingers steadier than before. When James climbed the stairs, the boards groaned beneath his boots. In the small room at the end of the hall, he dropped his pack on the bed and sat heavily. For the first time in years, the silence in his head was not restful. Clara's words echoed, soft yet sharp, leaving no peace. "A man doesn't need fear. He needs peace." Peace, the word gnawed at him. What did she know of men like him? What did she know of raids in the black of night? Of blood spilled so deep it stained memory itself? What did she know of betrayal? Of a brother's hand that once reached for his life and took everything good from it? James leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the pistol resting on the nightstand. That gun had given him power, control, and silence. Yet somehow a woman's voice had cracked what bullets never could. Downstairs, Clara moved quietly through the inn, sweeping the floor, tending the stove, offering bread to the two travelers who sat silent at the far table. She did not tell them who the new guest was. She carried the weight of his secret without bending to it, as though she bore truths heavier than any outlaw's name. The town, though, was not blind. Whispers already stirred along the street. Men at the saloon door muttered that Holloway had returned. The sheriff sat uneasily in his chair, his badge feeling heavier than usual. And riders on the horizon, too still, too watchful, waited like wolves scenting blood. But within the inn, time slowed. One man fought the silence he had bought with gold, and one woman held to the truth that could not be sold. And though neither would admit it yet, the meeting of the two had set a storm in motion. That night the inn lay wrapped in quiet. A thin moonlight spilled through the window, painting pale silver across the floorboards. James sat awake on the edge of the bed, his hat in his hands, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old building. He had slept in caves, barns, and ditches, but something about the stillness here unsettled him more than gunfire ever had. Every sound pressed on him, the rustle of wind through the shutters, the muffled cough of a traveler below, the soft tread of Clara's steps as she moved about. She lingered long after the town had gone to sleep, as though she carried a duty heavier than her small frame could carry. When he finally gave in to rest, his dreams came sharp and cruel. Firelight, gun smoke, men shouting, a woman's cry fading into the night. He saw faces he had tried to bury, men who had fallen under his gun, comrades who had betrayed him, and his younger brother's eyes turned cold with greed. He woke with sweat on his brow, his hand reaching for the pistol at his side before the nightmare cleared. At dawn, Clara knocked on the door, her voice steady but low. "Breakfast is ready." James hesitated before answering. "Leave it outside," but she did not. She stood in the hall until he opened the door, and then she set the tray in his hands, bread, black coffee, a slice of dried apple. He expected her to retreat, yet she lingered, her gaze brushing the pistol by his bed. "You dream loud," she said softly. His jaw tightened. "Not your concern." Clara tilted her head, studying him, not with judgment but with the same quiet patience she showed the inn's cracked walls and weary travelers. "Pain grows louder when it's buried." He set the tray down hard on the table. "Enough of your sayings. You don't know me." "You don't know what I've done." Her eyes did not falter. "You're right, but I know what fear looks like. And I know what peace can do, even for the worst of men. James turned away, unwilling to let her see the shadow that crossed his face. Yet something in her words stirred restlessly inside him, like embers refusing to die. That day passed in uneasy rhythm. James remained near the inn, his dark figure casting long shadows across the porch. The townsfolk kept their distance, though their whispers grew louder. They watched Clara, wondering why she dared house the outlaw. Some said she was a fool. Others whispered she was braver than the sheriff himself. By evening, a rider came in, dust on his boots and news on his tongue. Bounty hunters, he said, had been seen near the ridge. They rode hard, asking after James Holloway. The town stiffened with dread, yet no one dared speak too loudly. No one wanted to be the first to draw the outlaw's wrath. James heard the news through the thin walls of the inn. His hand went to the pistol again, the old instinct burning in him. Fight, run, strike first. It was the way he had lived, the way he had survived. But then his gaze slid to the window, where Clara tended roses in a cracked clay pot. She watered them with care as if they were treasure. Roses in a land of dust and drought, fragile, unlikely, yet still alive. He frowned, unsettled. That kind of persistence, gentle, quiet, refusing to die, was foreign to him. And yet, as he watched, he felt something shift inside. That night, as the lamps burned low, Clara passed him by the stairs. She paused, her hand brushing the railing, her voice almost a whisper. You don't have to keep running from your ghosts, James. Sometimes light waits where you least expect it. Her words struck harder than gunfire. He stood frozen long after she was gone, his breath tight, his thoughts unsteady. For the first time in years, he wondered, not about gold, not about silence, but about whether a man could crawl out from under the weight of his own shadow. The next morning, the town stirred restlessly. Whispers about bounty hunters spread like wildfire through the saloon, across the general store and up to the church steps. Men tightened their belts, women kept their children close. And no one walked past the inn without casting a glance at its weathered door. Inside, James sat near the window, hat tipped low, pistol on the table beside a half-empty cup of coffee. He had always lived by the rule of the gun. Whoever struck first, lived. But Clara's voice still haunted him, threading through the silence like a song he could not shake. She moved quietly about the room, carrying bread to the guests, sweeping near the hearth. Her presence steady as a heartbeat. James found himself watching her more than he should have. Not out of suspicion, though that had been his first instinct, but out of something he could not name. There was no fear in her, only a calm strength that pressed against his defenses like water wearing down stone. By midday, he caught her at the back of the inn, tending to the roses again. Their petals bent beneath the sun, fragile yet alive. You keep flowers in a place like this, James said, his voice rough. Clara looked up. Something gentle belongs even here. He leaned against the post, arms crossed. Gentle gets trampled. Gentle gets killed. She studied him, her hands brushing soil from her apron. Or gentle teaches what nothing else can. You've built your life on fear, James. Has it given you rest? He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He thought of the faces that haunted his sleep, of the endless miles ridden under stars that never offered light. Rest had never come, not once. Clara did not press. She turned back to her roses, as if the silence between them said enough. That evening, two strangers rode into town. They dismounted near the saloon, their coats long, their rifles slung low. Dust covered their boots, but their eyes were sharp and hungry. They asked questions with voices that carried too far, and the town stiffened. James knew the type. Bounty hunters. Wolves sniffing at his trail. They would not stop until gold or blood answered their hunger. When word reached the inn, Clara found James sitting on the porch cleaning his pistol. She stood before him, hands folded. They're asking about you, she said softly. I figured. His tone was flat, steady, like a man who had faced such hunts before. You'll fight them. I fought worse. Clara hesitated, then stepped closer. But you don't have to fight the same way you always have. James looked up at her. For a moment his hardened mask cracked and something raw flickered in his eyes. And what way is that? The way that leaves you emptier every time. Her words lodged deep and James turned his gaze back to the gun in his hands. The metal felt heavier than ever. He had lived by it, survived by it, but each pull of the trigger had taken something from him. Piece by piece it had hollowed him out. As dusk fell, the town grew still, waiting for what would come. The hunters lingered in the shadows, watching the inn with cold patience. The sheriff paced his office, too cautious to act, too aware of the blood that would spill if he tried. Inside, Clara lit a single lamp and set it in the window. Its glow reached faintly into the night, a small defiance against the darkness gathering outside. James watched the flame flicker, uneasy. He had never trusted light. Light revealed, exposed, uncovered sins better left hidden. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he did not blow the lamp out. He sat in its glow long after Clara had gone upstairs, the flame's quiet persistence echoing her words, and for the first time, James wondered if the fight coming his way might demand something different from him, something he had buried long ago. The night did not stay quiet for long. By dawn, word of the bounty hunters had spread beyond the town. Riders carried whispers along the trade roads, and with every retelling the story grew darker. Some said James Holloway had returned to raise an army. Others swore he planned to burn the town to ash. Fear had its own way of twisting truth until it was sharper than a blade. James sat at the inn's table, a plate untouched before him, while Clara moved about the room. The other guests avoided him, keeping their voices low as if the wrong word might invite his wrath. James was used to that. Fear was the shadow that had followed him across every town, every canyon, every stretch of earth. But Clara's eyes, calm, unyielding, were something else entirely. "You haven't eaten," she said, glancing at the bread cooling untouched. "Not hungry," James muttered. She set a cup of coffee before him. "Then drink. Men fight worse when they're hollow." He almost laughed at that, though the sound never reached his lips. Hollow, that was the word for him, all right. Hollow from years of blood and running. Hollow from silence he bought with gold. The door creaked open and the sheriff stepped in, his boots dragging dust across the floor. He was a man worn thin by years of keeping uneasy peace, and his badge glinted dully in the morning light. His eyes darted from James to Clara, then back to James. "Hunters are asking for you," the sheriff said flatly. "They want you turned over before nightfall." James leaned back, his hand brushing the pistol at his side. "Then they'll have to take me." The sheriff swallowed hard, his jaw tight. "This town's not built for war. If there's blood, it won't just be yours." Clara looked up sharply at that, her eyes meeting James's. There was no fear in her gaze, only quiet warning. He felt it like a weight pressing on his chest. When the sheriff left, the silence between them grew heavy. James stood and paced, the floor creaking beneath his boots. "I've been hunted before," he said. "I know how this ends." Clara spoke softly, her hand steady as she folded a cloth on the counter. "It doesn't have to end the same way." He turned, his voice sharp. "Men like me don't change their ending." Her gaze didn't falter. Maybe not by themselves. But no man walks alone forever. James froze at that. Alone, yes, that had been his life. Every bond broken, every hand turned against him. Yet here was this woman standing in the quiet, offering words instead of fear. He didn't know whether to be angered or undone by it. That afternoon, the bounty hunters stepped boldly into the street. Their spurs rang sharp against the boards, their eyes scanning the buildings like predators sniffing for prey. The townsfolk ducked inside, shutters slamming, doors bolted. The hunters stopped in front of the inn. James watched from the upstairs window, their faces clear in the dim light. He knew the look well, cold, hungry, driven by gold. He had worn it once himself. His hand hovered near his gun, every instinct screaming to strike first, to end the hunt before it began. But then, from below, he heard Clara's voice carrying through the thin walls, calm and unshaken as she spoke to a traveler at the table. Ordinary words, small words, but they held a steadiness that reached him. James drew back from the window, his breath tight. He had lived his whole life with the sound of fear and rage. He did not know what to do with the sound of gentleness that did not bend. Outside, the hunters waited. Inside, James wrestled with ghosts that no bullet could kill. And as the sun slid lower in the sky, it became clear the storm was drawing closer. The sun dropped behind the ridge and the street filled with long shadows. Lanterns flickered weakly in windows, but most shutters stayed closed tight. The town had gone silent, waiting for the sound of gunfire. James stood by the inn's door, pistol heavy at his side. His body was steady, but inside his chest a storm raged. He had lived for moments like this, when the hunt closed in and only steel and speed decided who walked away. Yet this time felt different. The silence of the street carried Clara's voice echoing from earlier. No man walks alone forever. Clara moved about the room as though nothing outside had changed. She set plates back on the shelf, folded cloths, and stoked the fire. But James could see her glance at the window, at the hunters gathered in the street. Her face stayed calm, though her hands gripped the edge of the table a little too tightly. Finally, heavy boots struck the porch. The door rattled under a hard knock. "James Holloway," a voice barked, sharp as a whip. "Come out. There's a price on your head and we're here to claim it." James's hand slid toward his gun, but Clara stepped between him and the door. "Wait," he glared at her. "They won't wait." "Then don't meet them with the same rage they bring," she said, her voice low, steady. He almost laughed. "That's the only way I've ever lived." But before he could argue more, the door swung open. Two hunters stepped inside, rifles gleaming in the dim light. Their eyes swept the room, landing on James like vultures spotting meat. "Well, well," one sneered. "The ghost himself, Holloway." James straightened, his shadow long against the wall. "You found me." The second hunter raised his rifle. "You can come quietly or you can come dead. Either way, the gold's the same to us." The old fire in James stirred, hot and dangerous. His fingers brushed the grip of his pistol. For a breath, he was ready to end it the way he always had, fast, brutal, final. But then Clara stepped forward, her small frame between him and the rifles. The hunters froze, startled. "This is a house of peace," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "No blood will be spilled here." The hunters scoffed, one spitting on the floorboards. "Lady, you don't know who you're standing in front of. He's a killer. He's got more sins than a church could count." Clara's chin lifted. "Maybe, but he's still a man. And a man can choose to change." Her words struck James like a blow. He had never heard anyone speak of him that way. Not since before the blood, before the betrayals, before the years of silence bought with gold. For the first time, someone named him not as a monster, but as a man who could turn another way. The hunters laughed, rough and sharp. "Change? Holloway's soul is blacker than tar. Ain't no light left in him." Clara didn't flinch. She looked at James then, not the hunters, her gaze steady as stone. "Prove them wrong." The room held still, the fire crackling in the hearth the only sound. James's heart hammered, torn between the life he had lived and the one her words dared him to imagine. His hand trembled near the pistol, but he did not draw. Not yet. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of choice pressing harder than the weight of survival. The hunters shifted, uneasy at the silence. One stepped closer, rifle raised higher. And in that tense moment, James realized the storm inside him was louder than the men before him. The room felt like it would snap. The hunters stood with rifles raised, sweat shining on their brows. James stood behind Clara, his hand twitching near his pistol, every muscle tight as a coiled rope. "Step aside, woman," one hunter barked. "This ain't your fight." Clara didn't move. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "Then make it mine. You'll spill no blood in this house." The hunter laughed, sharp and ugly. "You think a word will stop a bullet?" James's chest burned. He had seen courage in men, but never like this, gentle, quiet, and unarmed. Clara's defiance unsettled the hunters, but it shattered something inside James. He could not let her fall because of his sins. He stepped forward, pushing Clara gently behind him. His voice came low and even. "You want me? Then you leave the town out of it." "Leave her out of it." The hunter smirked, rifle steady. "You planning to beg your way out, Holloway?" James shook his head. "No, I'm telling you, I'm done spilling blood." The words surprised even him. He had not planned to say them. They rose from somewhere deep, somewhere long buried. The hunter scoffed. "You think that buys you mercy?" "No," James said, his voice firm now. "But it changes what I do next." The first hunter shifted, ready to fire. In that breath, time seemed to slow. James's instincts screamed for violence, but Clara's words echoed louder. "A man doesn't need fear. He needs peace." His hand moved quickly, but not for his pistol. He reached for the hunter's rifle, shoving it aside with sudden force. The gun fired, the shot burying itself harmlessly into the wall. Before the man could recover, James struck him hard, sending the rifle clattering across the floor. The second hunter raised his weapon, but James twisted, grabbing the man's arm and slamming it against the doorframe. The rifle dropped, and in the scramble, James kicked it far from reach. The two hunters staggered back, eyes wide. They had expected bullets, not mercy. James stood over them, chest heaving, fist tight, but he did not draw his pistol. His choice was clear. "Go," he growled. "Leave this town. Leave her. Tell whoever sent you that Holloway's done." The hunters stared at him, disbelief etched in their faces. They had seen killers, desperate men who fought like cornered animals, but they had never seen an outlaw spare his prey. One hunter spat on the floor, clutching his bruised arm. "You'll regret this." James stepped closer, his shadow falling heavy. "Not as much as I'd regret becoming the man I was." The hunters backed toward the door, their pride wounded more than their bodies. They mounted their horses under the watching eyes of the town and rode hard into the dusk, leaving dust and silence behind. When they were gone, James stood in the doorway, his breath rough, his hands shaking with the weight of what he had chosen. Behind him, Clara's voice came soft. "You spared them." He turned to her, his jaw tight. "For you. For what you said." Clara shook her head gently. "Not for me, James, for yourself." The word struck deep, truer than he wanted to admit. For years he had thought his soul was too blackened to be touched, but tonight, for the first time, he had chosen something other than blood. And though the road ahead was uncertain, he felt a small spark, something like light, pierce through the darkness he had carried for so long. The town woke to whispers. By morning, word had spread from the saloon to the blacksmith shop. From the church steps to the dusty well, James Holloway had spared 2 bounty hunters. Men leaned close at the bar, speaking in low voices, their mugs left untouched. Women gathered by the store, shaking their heads in disbelief. Children, usually shooed indoors when danger came, whispered of the outlaw who had chosen not to kill. Some said it was a trick, that James was biding his time. Others claimed Clara had bewitched him, softened his heart with her quiet ways. But beneath the doubt, something new stirred in the air. Hope. At the inn, James sat at the corner table, hat low, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee gone cold. He could feel the weight of the town's eyes even from behind the shutters. They were watching, waiting, measuring him against the stories they had told for years. Clara moved about as always, setting plates down, sweeping dust from the corners. She did not treat him like a hero nor like a criminal. She simply treated him as a man who had chosen differently. That, more than the town's whispers, unsettled him. When the sheriff came by, his face carried both relief and suspicion. He sat across from James, his chair creaking under him. "You spared them," the sheriff said, his voice rough, half question, half statement. James nodded once. "Didn't seem worth killing." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "Men like you don't usually change stripes." James met his gaze, steady. "Maybe I'm tired of being a man like me." The sheriff said nothing more. He stood, adjusted his badge, and left, leaving only the sound of boots on the porch. Later that day, Clara found James by the stable, brushing down his black horse. The animal's breath steamed in the cool air, its eyes restless. James's hands moved steadily, though his thoughts churned. "You think the town will forgive you?" Clara asked gently. James kept his eyes on the horse. "Don't matter. Forgiveness doesn't change what's been done." Clara stepped closer. "Maybe not, but it changes what comes next." He stilled, the brush pausing in his hand. Her words stirred something deep, unfamiliar and sharp. For so long his life had been a line of violence stretching behind him, each step chained to the last. The thought of a future unbound by blood felt like staring into a land he'd never seen. That night, as the lamps flickered low, James walked the quiet street alone. The town gave him space, doors locked, curtains pulled back just enough for cautious eyes. He felt their stares but did not return them. Instead, he stopped by the church on the hill. Its wood was cracked, its bell rusted silent, but the door stood open. Inside, dust lay thick across the pews. James stepped in, his boots echoing. For the first time in years, he sat where once, as a boy, he had sat beside his mother. Memories stirred, her hand on his shoulder, her voice in prayer. He lowered his head, not in prayer, not in words, but in silence. A silence not bought with gold, but given freely. It was heavy, yet somehow lighter than the silence he had carried all these years. When he rose, the night air felt different. He was still James Holloway, outlaw and sinner, but somewhere in him a seed had been planted, small and fragile, and though he did not yet know how to tend it, he could not deny it was there. Days passed, but peace did not last. The bounty hunters James had spared rode hard to their camp in the hills. Their pride burned hotter than their wounds, and word spread quickly among men hungry for gold. Before long, more riders gathered, rough men with rifles and greed in their eyes. They wanted Holloway's head, and they wanted it now. The town felt the weight of it. Travelers stopped coming, wagons turned away at the ridge, and even the saloon grew quiet. Every soul knew trouble was riding back, heavier and meaner than before. Clara saw it in the way people looked at James, half fearful, half uncertain. He had spared blood once, but could he hold back again when the storm broke? One evening she found him outside the inn, sharpening a knife by lantern light. His face was hard, shadows cutting across his jaw. For a moment he looked every bit the outlaw the world believed him to be. "They'll be back," Clara said quietly. James nodded without looking up. "They'll bring more with them. And what will you do?" He paused, the knife still in his hand. His voice came low. "The man I was would have met them head on. Guns blazing. Leave a field of dead behind." Clara stepped closer, her eyes fixed on him. "And the man you are now." James set the knife down slowly, staring into the lantern flame. "I don't know yet." Silence stretched between them, filled with the crackle of the lantern and the whisper of wind. Then Clara spoke, her voice firm. "You know more than you think. You've already chosen once." Her words stirred something deep. He had chosen, yes, not to kill when he could have. But could he do it again? With more guns aimed at him, with the whole town trembling behind him? The next morning riders were spotted on the ridge. Dust rose in thick clouds, and the faint glint of rifles caught the sun. The town braced itself, doors barred, windows shuttered. The sheriff called for men to stand ready, though his own hand shook when it brushed the grip of his revolver. James stood in the center of the street, hat low, pistol at his hip. He looked like the outlaw of old, yet something in his stance was different. Less a man hunting death, more a man standing between it and the people behind him. Clara came to his side, her presence steady, her eyes calm, though danger loomed. "You don't have to face this alone," she said softly. He gave her a long look, words caught in his throat. For so long he had walked as a shadow, carrying his sins alone. Now for the first time someone stood beside him, not with a gun but with truth. The thunder of hooves grew louder. The bounty hunters rode into town, more than a dozen strong, rifles gleaming, voices sharp. They reined in their horses, dust swirling, eyes locked on James. "There he is," one growled. "Holloway." The leader, a tall man with scars across his cheek, spat into the dust. You made fools of my men. That ends today. You'll come with us, dead or alive. James stood tall, his hand near his pistol, but he did not draw. His voice rang clear across the silent street. I've shed enough blood. If you want me, you'll face me, but I won't slaughter this town for your gold. The hunters laughed, their cruel voices echoing off the wooden walls. Yet even in their laughter, unease flickered. They expected a cornered wolf, not a man refusing to bare his fangs. Behind James, the townsfolk began to stir, peeking from windows, gathering their courage. For the first time, they saw something other than a feared outlaw. They saw a man standing between them and the storm, and as the hunters shifted in their saddles, Clara whispered at James's side, her voice steady as stone. Whatever happens, you're not the man you were. Don't forget that. The air thickened, the moment stretched, and the final reckoning loomed. The street was silent but for the snort of horses and the faint rattle of spurs. The bounty hunters shifted in their saddles, waiting for the moment to strike. James stood tall, hat brim low, his shadow stretching across the dust. Clara remained at his side, her hands folded, her calm presence stronger than any weapon. The scarred leader sneered. Enough talk, Holloway. Draw your gun or we'll tear this town apart. James's hand hovered near his pistol, but he didn't draw. Instead, he took a slow step forward. His voice carried clearly across the street. I've done my share of killing, paid for silence in blood and gold. But that ends here. If you want me, then take me. But you'll do it without me spilling one more drop. A murmur rose from the townsfolk hiding behind doors and shutters. The words sounded strange in the mouth of an outlaw, but they rang with a weight no bullet could silence. The bounty hunters shifted, some with doubt in their eyes. They had expected a desperate fight, not a man standing in surrender to truth. Clara spoke then, her voice steady, cutting through the tension like a bell. You men came for gold, but look at him. He's no outlaw now. He's a man who's chosen the light. Do you really want to trade your lives for a ghost of who he used to be? The leader snarled, but his men hesitated. Some looked away uneasy. One spat into the dust. He ain't worth dying for. Bit by bit, the hunters pulled their reins. One by one, they turned their horses, their greed outweighed by doubt. Only the scarred leader remained, rage burning in his eyes. You think mercy makes you strong, Holloway? He growled. It makes you weak. James met his gaze. No. Mercy's the only thing that ever made me strong. The leader's hand twitched toward his gun, but James didn't move. Clara didn't flinch. And in that moment something broke in the man's resolve. With a curse, he yanked his horse's reins and rode off, dust trailing in his wake. Silence followed, heavy and trembling, until at last the sheriff stepped forward. His badge caught the fading sun, his voice steady but softer than before. Reckon the town owes you its peace, Holloway. James said nothing. He only lowered his head, his shoulders heavy but unburdened in a way they had never been. Later that evening, as lamps flickered to life and the town slowly breathed again, Clara found him sitting on the porch of the inn. He looked out at the quiet street, where no gunfire had fallen, where no blood stained the dust. I don't deserve this, he said low. Clara sat beside him. No one deserves grace, but we can still choose it. He turned to her then, the hardness in his eyes softened. For years he had bought silence with gold, burying his past in fear. But Clara had given him something no coin could buy. Truth, spoken with gentleness. And in her truth, he had found a way back. As the night spread over the frontier town, James Holloway made his choice. No longer the outlaw who paid for silence. He would walk the harder road, the road of light, of mercy, of redemption, and this time, he would not walk it alone. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and frontier courage, make sure to subscribe to Shadow Frontier Tales for more Wild West stories every week. And if this story touched you, leave a like and share it with someone who loves frontier romance. Your support keeps these stories alive.